Mark White, let's get your take on that. A lot of people, you and I sat through endless rafts of evidence, some very fruity stuff from the likes of Dominic Cummings, and I was shouting at the screen all the time, why aren't you asking the question? Why did we even have these punishing lockdowns that have annihilated the economy, broken mental health, killed businesses? And we were called conspiracy theorists for saying that. And look, the inquiry has concluded today. Lockdowns could have been avoided entirely.
Yes, and remember, of course, the police were used as an arm of the state to enforce these lockdowns as well. You had the ridiculous situation of people going for a walk in the open countryside in the north of the country, being surveilled by police drones that were up, people that found themselves in trouble for going out and about in public areas where you are obviously in the open air going to stand much less prospect of coming in contact with an airborne contagion than you are if you're out in the countryside. But yes, the government reacted, and it certainly, fed off the information it was getting from its own scientific advisors, and they had advised throughout that we need to go, harder and faster to lock down the population.
And just getting fresh information coming in here, Mark White. So Baroness Hallett, who's the inquiry chairman, chairwoman, chairperson, chair they, them, who knows these days, says that if stringent restrictions had been put in place before March the 16th, 2020, of course that was the date of the first lockdown, then there might have been no need for lockdown. So they're basically saying here, if they'd been stricter before lockdowns, we wouldn't have needed lockdowns, which I think feels like a bit of a reverse ferret.
Yeah, or they're softening us up for the next major crisis when they need to go tougher, quicker. But yeah, I get, at the end of the day, it was a global pandemic that took so many governments around the world by surprise. But there were some governments that decided not to be as draconian in the measures that they implemented and seemed to do quite well out of it regardless. The pandemic actually passed through their population quicker, but it was all about that mantra of protect the NHS, but at the expense of school children not being able to go to school, the elderly in care homes who were then subject to people coming out of the hospital and shoved into their care homes, who then infected those care homes, and these elderly, vulnerable and frail people died off at a rate of knots as well.
And the conclusion here, the report is saying a toxic and chaotic culture at the centre of the government meant the pandemic response was often too little, too late, meaning a lockdown became inevitable. So it sounds like more bad news here for Boris Johnson's Conservative government getting the blame, the brunt of it here. Isn't it funny, though, how none of the governments present or at the time have admitted the huge economic annihilation that lockdowns cause? They blame Brexit, they blame everything but their own actions. And this report today concluding lockdowns could have been avoided entirely. They should all look themselves in the mirror and think about that. The untold damage been done to business, to mental health, to the fabric of the nation, to cultural cohesion, societal cohesion, and the annihilation of our economy. The whole thing could have been avoided. A few of us said it all along and we were called mad. Let's get some immediate reaction now from a great friend of the show, and that's the independent statistician and the political commentator, Jamie Jenkins. Jamie, welcome to the show. A pleasure to have your company. A lot of us said all along that the economic impact of lockdowns has been absolutely horrendous to the economy. It's something they try and blame Brexit. They try and blame everything. We know lockdowns cause a huge impact. And the COVID inquiry today has concluded we wouldn't have needed lockdowns at all.
Yeah, I think it was quite strange in this one, though, is they're saying that if we'd had an earlier lockdown and taken earlier measures, we wouldn't have needed further lockdowns. But what we consistently saw during the pandemic, Martin, and I was covering a lot of the facts across the pandemic quite weekly, and what we were seeing is that pretty much like every time we had a wave of COVID, you saw a big rise in cases, and then sometimes that led to hospitalizations, and then they fell off again. And then we got to a point where it was unsustainable for the country to continue to have lockdowns. So we went back into this living with COVID situation. And we saw exactly the same trend when we didn't have those lockdowns then as what we did when we had lockdowns. And what's quite interesting as well is that for the very first time, I think there was a lot of call in 2021 when their Omicron variant hit the country. There was a big SAGE model saying that if we don't lock down, this is what's going to happen. Boris Johnson knew economically we couldn't do it late in 2021. And that was the first time during the pandemic we were able to actually track what actually happened by not doing something versus the model in itself. And the model was awful. It was 93% of the deaths were lower than what the modelling was predicting. So I'm not surprised the COVID inquiry's concluding this, because I think a lot of us, and probably you included, thought this is the kind of thing they would come up with.
You're entirely right, Jamie Jenkins, to say that they're still trying to say, oh, no, we should have just locked down a bit earlier. If we'd done it a bit earlier, we wouldn't need the hammering lockdowns later on. Jamie Jenkins, I put it to you. At the time, people like myself, I was on national television saying, well, look at Sweden. Sweden has been much more sensible. They're trying to control the outbreak in public. Places like Florida, places like Texas. And that debate was continually suppressed. The government wouldn't allow it. The mainstream media wouldn't allow it. And the fact of the matter is, perhaps the conclusion of today's report is half right. We didn't need lockdowns at all. We should have just shielded the most vulnerable and let society get on with it.
Yeah, there's a good case for the most vulnerable, and kind of looking at the overwhelming of hospitals. But I think the key crucial part in all of this is that when we stopped having lockdowns, we did consider seeing cases go up. And then if you plot the trend, they say they went up, stayed up for a few weeks, and then they came back down, just natural waves as we went through the pandemic. And for me, the critical part is what the COVID pandemic and the inquiry is not looking at is, looking at the modelling that we talked about just now there, that 93% figure that they were out on the COVID model in late 2021. They're saying that, they've done modelling to assess how many deaths that could have been saved had we had an earlier lockdown. Well, if the models they were doing at the time were awful, I'd take some of those with a bit of a pinch of salt as well, Martin.
Do you think politically we have a situation here where the right questions were never asked at the time because we had political conformity? Every political party at the time wanted lockdowns. And as I said earlier, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the so-called opposition, they wanted more of it. They wanted harder, sooner, longer lockdowns. Nobody ever said, hang on a minute, are we sure? It was that phrase, it was a uni-party approach.
Yeah, there was what I would say groupthink in terms of most of the Western world, really, that one country did it. I think we started seeing the emerging in Italy. They started looking at measures, and more countries started doing the same thing. It was a bit like what you talk about Sweden there, that a country couldn't stand out on its own and do something different because, this could be a travesty if we don't do it. But the things that we've talked about on the show recently, that the cost of borrowing figures, the unemployment numbers, the state of the economy, all of this goes back to the decisions that were made during COVID. And it's quite easy for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer to criticise the Conservatives for racking up debt themselves. But the debts would have probably been higher. There would have been longer lockdowns. And when Rishi Sunak stood up on the podium offering that furlough scheme, people were like, look, great, this is great. He's paying us to stay at home. But who's paying for it now, Martin? We all are. So I think that's ultimately, if they looked at those political decisions, I don't think the COVID inquiry is, it's going to have this big, long report. It's going to be sat on a shelf somewhere. And is it going to really change how we would do things in the future? By the looks of it, probably not.
Now, Jamie Jenkins, of course, some people would say that lives were saved by lockdowns, and nobody can deny that a sensible strategy of protecting the most vulnerable, protecting the elderly, protecting those with underlying health conditions would have been a sensible thing that everybody agrees is a great idea. But that didn't happen. In fact, care homes became, scenes of tragedy when victims were put back into them. But back to your economic point, we talk all the time on the show, Jamie Jenkins, you and I, about the addiction almost that people got for benefits, for being paid to not work. Do you think that COVID lockdowns played a huge part of programming people to be paid to not work?
I think there's an element to that. I suppose one of the benefits is a positive and a negative to say some of the flexible working that we have as well, with a lot of people working from home. I think it's great to get people in the office. In particular, a lot of the civil service, a lot of them don't even go back. And has that had an impact on the productivity puzzle there? I think that is one of the overarching things that COVID may kind of deliver. And you hit a really good point there as well. So I'm a football coach, Martin, as well. And the travesty for me was that, and Chris Whitty's come out recently saying that we should never have done this, which was that we were actually allowing children initially before they closed the schools to go into classrooms, but they weren't allowed to come out and do some sport outdoors, which is absolute nonsense. And that's the real thing. We've got to remember the damage that we've done to the younger people. Totally support the idea of like shielding the vulnerable and looking at that part. Well, what do? We discharged people from hospitals back into care homes, possibly with the virus. That was probably another travesty that was done. But I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned on this one, Martin. But I don't think the COVID pandemic has asked the right questions. And for me, the modelling, putting my statistician's hat back on, the modelling was awful during the pandemic. And it's the data that was leading to a lot of these decisions in the first place. And the politicians didn't really have the good facts in front of them.
Jamie Jenkins, I know you're an expert on data analysis and you were across the modelling at the time. Do you think that the government can be accused, the advisors, the experts can be accused of simply going for the doomsday scenario? And that was the problem.
Oh, definitely. You could see with that model I just talked about, where Sage were predicting so many deaths if Boris didn't do another kind of big lockdown in 2021. That was the kind of the variant that was a bit less deadly, but it had a lot more kind of transmission. And the one good thing with, say, Boris not doing anything, we were then able to say, look, let's look at the actual data for the first time, what actually happened, because basically they modelled different scenarios and say when deaths were 93% lower with Boris not doing anything. He had a lot of criticism at the time, actually. I remember it. And he didn't do anything. Deaths were significantly lower. So would they have been a lot lower if we hadn't have done things? What we don't have, Martin, is we don't have, because we can't go back in time to say, well, what if we never locked down? What would have been the outcome? But looking at the data a bit later on in the pandemic, there was not a massive difference in terms of the ups and downs of the curves when we didn't lock down versus when we did.
Jamie Jenkins, could also ask you about something else that was a huge talking point at the time, and it's back again, and that is track and trace, COVID passports. Now we're seeing it manifesting itself, of course, as a digital ID. Is that something else that government officials and prime ministers got a taste for during lockdowns? Authoritarianism, using technology as a way of tracking us. Even, remember at the time, it's incredible to believe now, as you said, people weren't allowed to play children's football. They weren't allowed to go to church, to gyms, to congregate, sometimes even to the most basic of human rights gatherings. And now it's back. Tony Blair was a huge driver of the COVID passports, modelled on Israel's Green Pass. Michael Gove got a taste for it. They all got a taste for it. Is that authoritarian streak, is that coming back? And do you think COVID inspired it?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. The mental thing, I suppose, with the COVID passport at the time was that, if you remember, they said that you couldn't go into nightclubs if you didn't have your jab and your COVID passport. And then not long after doing that, Martin, they then closed the nightclubs because the COVID cases were going up. So they clearly had no impact. People were having vaccines to go on holiday, many people who were probably at very low risk from the virus themselves. And then what we were then still seeing kind of travel bans. I know Novak Djokovic had a lot of criticism for deciding not to have the vaccine at the time, and he couldn't play in some tournaments. He's come out of it the other end and things. So we're going into this era now where they're talking of doing digital ID, and the way they're selling it to the public in terms of, well, it will reduce illegal immigration and illegal working, when we know across many countries in Europe, illegal working is getting worse. They've got digital ID. So I think, the COVID pandemic was the start of that taste of a bit of authoritarian over the public. And digital ID is clearly an area we don't want to go. We've only seen this week, haven't we, the internet and the crashes that happen. If everything's relying on digital ID and you're looking there and you think, well, I can't do something because the internet's gone down, that's not a road we want to really be going down.